Well, you know, again, so often in politics today, I think we look at things and assume that there are only two solutions. You know, the red solution or the blue solution. And I think in many of the areas that we're dealing with today, we need to look beyond that. We need to say, what are other solutions that can really help us? You know, the reality is brownbacks certainly accelerated the decline in lots of trends in Kansas. But there are lots of things in Kansas where we've had issues that have been going on for a while. You know, tuition has outstripped the rate of inflation in higher education for over 2 decades in Kansas. You know, our pension fund went from being $2 billion underfunded in 2001 to $8 billion underfunded today. You know, we've had median household income in Kansas that hasn't exceeded the levels that it set in 2003. You know, so there have been lots of issues that have been going on a long time where we have been going back and forth between two sides and two solutions, and I think we need to start looking for new solutions.
Well, I can say, you know, in something like, yeah, there's always a middle ground, I believe, and that's what I've always worked towards. And I can think of something like the pension system. You know, it was not working. We were terribly underfunded, and so we came together. I was actually on the Capers Commission, Study Commission, and we came together, and it started out with the Republicans on that commission wanting to move us to a 401k program, which quite honestly does not work particularly well for employees. It works well for the employer, but for employees in these kinds of jobs, you know, who really don't have a lot of money to risk, it's tough. And depends on when they retire, whether there's going to be a lot of money or not so much money. We needed to provide something more stable for that. So by working with my Republican friends, we were able to forge a compromise, which ended up with us moving away from the defined benefit plan as we've known for a long time, which has become unsustainable for our state and a whole host of states, but moving towards a cash balance plan that we know works. Nebraska's been using it for a long time, and it works for employees in the long run, and it works for the state in the long run. And we were able to forge that compromise when we were first starting on opposite sides of the aisle. So there are a number of things that we can do that. In fact, I don't think there's an issue out there that we can't, if we want to, create a solution that works for Kansas.
All right, we'll move on to our next question.
The Department for Children and Families has seen a change in leadership, scores of staffing changes, and several high-profile child deaths. What are your thoughts on the current operation of DCF, and what changes would you anticipate making if elected?
Well, you know, I don't know that we've had enough time with the new administration to really be able to evaluate the effectiveness of it. But I think what we've seen is this is what happens when we make overly political appointment decisions. You know, when Phyllis Gilmore was appointed to that role, that wasn't based on her track record, that wasn't based on her experience in running a large organization, that was based on political loyalty. You know, we've talked about DCF at length. I think we need to have a much more robust citizens advocate program for DCF. I think we need to have transparency of results across all of our agencies, but DCF most notably. And I think we really need to look at the goals and the objectives of DCF and make sure that ultimately we're not creating a scenario where we're giving the state an incentive to terminate parental rights. So we obviously have to protect our children, but at the same time we want to work to keep families together. You know, part of the challenge I think we're seeing with DCF also is it happens to be coinciding with a growth in opioid dependency and usage in the state of Kansas. And talking to people at KVC when they're looking at this issue, one of the challenges they see is the amount of time that it takes someone to wean themselves from an opioid use disorder also happens to coincide with the length of time it takes to terminate parental rights. And so we've got a misalignment there as well. We're not giving people the opportunity to fix themselves. The other thing in talking to folks in the CanCare program that I found is because of our positions in DCF in terms of how we've aggressively pulled kids away, they've said that pregnant mothers are reluctant to get prenatal care, even if they're on Medicaid, because they don't want their other children taken away. And so I think we need to align better with the needs of the family and make sure that ultimately we're not creating a disincentive for positive behaviors like prenatal care.
Senator.
You know, I've been dealing with the DCF issue for several years now, and I'm actually on the Child Welfare Task Force that's been meeting now for a year to address the very deep and broad issues in that agency. And don't like to ordinarily take a lot of credit, but you know, Phyllis Gilmore might still be there if it hadn't been for me. I was in a child welfare meeting one day, and I was flipping through Twitter, and I come upon this story of these 3 sisters in foster care who were missing. And I thought, well, this is interesting. So I try not to, you know, I try not to hit people without warning. So I went up to the secretary as we were breaking for lunch, and I said, Phyllis, I found this, and I'm going to bring it up this afternoon. As it turns out, what she told me was she had no idea that these girls were missing, and they had been missing for 45 days. This wasn't new. So we come back after lunch, and we find out not only are these girls missing, there are 70 other kids missing from DCF. They have no idea where these kids are. It didn't take long after that for Phyllis Gilmore to step down and a new secretary to be put into place. We just sort of outed the incompetence. So you asked, what about the new administration? Are they doing better? And I will say, yes, they are. You know, we have, am I pleased entirely? Not yet. We have a lot more work to do, but we also have to play our part. You know, the state has to be a partner in this, and we have been the worst partner possible. You know, what we have done to that agency, we've decimated that agency. We have stripped them of I don't know how many social workers, so that we have no social workers who are working with our families, who are working on family preservation, trying to keep those families together. That's not there. They go right into the system. And then they get in the system, and we have no social workers to work on reintegration, to get them to an adoptive family or back with their biological family. Those don't exist. That's why those kids are getting stuck in there. And aside from the opioid problem that we have, which does account for an increase from 5,000 kids in foster care when Brownback took office, which is a horrible number in and of itself, but now it's over 7,700 kids who are in our foster care system. And one of the other things that we did as a legislature, I of course did not vote for this, is we passed the Hopeless Act. And sister, I know you know this better than I. They called it the Hope Act. I'd never do. I always call it the Hopeless Act because what we did was we stripped the safety net out from our most vulnerable families, and they were no longer able, you know, to keep their stuff together, to keep their kids in their homes. We are complicit in what has happened in our foster care system, and we have a moral obligation to change it, and I will do that.
All right, I think we're ready to move on to the next question.
Various sources have given state government poor marks on transparency. What specific changes would you propose to make government more open and accessible to the people of Kansas?
Senator.
I'm up?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first, I would elect Brian McClendon, Secretary of State. Because there's nobody better to ensure that we have transparency in state government. You heard what he said about the website. You heard what he said about putting the information out there. When Brian is Secretary of State and I'm Governor, we will work together to make sure that the information about state government is out there, accessible, and readable for people across the state. That's one thing that we will do. I'll work with the legislature. There are some things going on in the legislature that need to be out there more. We have taken some steps. We now have live audio streaming, I believe, of the Senate, which we never did before. We've got, I think, live audio and video streaming of the House, and we're doing that, and we're at least doing live audio streaming in most, if not all, of our committees. That's a step in the right direction that we have taken. We need to do some stuff about how to identify who introduces bills and who sponsors bills, because that's been very, very difficult to do. And it's a tricky thing. I don't want to pretend that it's going to be easy to do, but there are ways of doing it and still allowing the system to work. So we'll work with the legislature on those kinds of things. But I am most concerned about the transparency that doesn't happen within the executive branch. We've talked about the foster care system for a while, but the other thing that we have is we have 1,000 no-bid contracts that are in place right now that took place behind closed doors. We had no idea, and I'm going to guarantee you, there may be some of those that are good for the people in the state of Kansas, but I'm guessing that there are a whole lot more that are not. We will review every single one of those contracts, and if it's good for Kansas, we'll keep it. If it's not, we will get rid of it.
Transparency is actually one of the 5 priorities we've been talking about since the beginning of this campaign. And I want to make Kansas government the most transparent, effective, and accountable government in the nation. Obviously, we have to enforce the Kansas Open Records Act. Obviously, we have to deal with issues like private email servers, those sorts of things. But the most important transparency I want to bring to Kansas is a transparency of results. The state of Kansas spends a lot of money through a number of agencies, and we have very little clarity as to what kind of results we're getting for the dollars we're spending. So I think we need a much more transparent report card on every state agency. I think we need to put in place a chief performance officer whose responsibility will be to evaluate those results, and to the extent we're not getting the outcomes we expect, to take corrective actions. I also believe in the legislative process, and I've said this openly, I'm not going to sign any bills that don't have names attached to them. So if it's not worthy of the sponsor's name, it's not worthy of my signature. And I understand there's a lot of reasons why people like to hide their identity and who's getting involved. But at the end of the day, we just need to change that process once and for all. And so I think there are a handful of things that we need to do. We've put a very detailed transparency plan on our website. It's available for everybody to see. The other thing I want to do is I want to open up the governor's office. During the Brownback administration, one of the real knocks on him was that he wouldn't not only not talk to constituents, he wouldn't talk to legislators who disagreed with him. I'm a private sector person. I believe intellectual conflict's a good thing. And so we've also talked about doing 3 things. Number 1, having office hours for the governor so that any Kansas citizen can make an appointment with the governor to come and share their concerns. I understand there might be some scheduling issues there, but we'll work through them. I've talked about having weekly legislative breakfasts where any legislator who wants to come and talk to the governor can come and participate in that breakfast. I've talked about doing monthly telephone town hall meetings so that we have full transparency of what's going on in the governor's office in the state of Kansas. Finally, as it relates to no-bid contracts, I think we need to just commit ourselves, and I've said this in my transparency and effectiveness plan, that we will not engage in no-bid contracts except in instances of emergency. And then if it's an instance of emergency, we'll make sure that we are fully transparent about what we did and why we did it.